He sat alone week after week, clutching a worn folder that no one cared to open. They called him a fake. They laughed, but he said nothing. Because some wounds don't bleed. They linger in silence, waiting to be seen. And just when it seemed the world had truly forgotten him, a single sentence from a four-star general shattered 70 years of shameful silence. This man carried me through gunfire and saved my life. What follows is not just a story of war, but of dignity lost and reclaimed, of a forgotten Marine, a persistent intern, and a nation forced to remember one of its quietest heroes. This isn't just about medals. It's about memory, about honor, and about the power of one voice standing up when everyone else looked away. Because sometimes the smallest salute can carry the weight of 1,000 thank yous. Sam turned slightly. The words stung, though his expression didn't change. He had heard worse, much worse. Still, there was a flicker in his eyes, grief or exhaustion. It was hard to tell, but it passed like a wave receding quietly, and he gathered his folder with both hands. Carefully, deliberately, he closed it and held it tight against his chest. He stepped aside, as requested, moving slowly toward the waiting chairs again. No one offered a seat. No one made eye contact. He settled back into the same spot by the wall, folded his hands over the folder, and stared down at the scuffed linoleum. Rachel Monroe watched it all from behind the glass. Her chest tightened, a pressure she couldn't explain. Her training hadn't covered this part, the part where dignity was invisible unless someone insisted on seeing it. She glanced at her supervisor, a bored man in his 50s tapping away at his keyboard, and then looked back at the old man by the wall. There was something sacred about the way he sat. Not proud, not bitter, just waiting. Like a soldier on silent watch, long after the war had ended. The next 20 minutes passed with the usual shuffle of numbers and paperwork. People came and went, coffee cups refilled. The low murmur of conversation filled the room. And Sam Carter remained as still as he had been when he arrived, that worn leather folder resting on his knees like a relic no one else believed in. Then the doors hissed open again at precisely 8:47 a.m. This time, the coal that rushed in was chased by authority. Boots, shined to a mirror polish, struck the tile floor in a measured rhythm. A man in full-dress uniform entered, broad-shouldered, his coat adorned with ribbons and stars that caught the fluorescence above. A four-star general. The room fell quiet almost instantly. Phones were lowered, coffee cups paused midair. Even Dana at the counter straightened in her chair, unsure whether to stand. The general walked with purpose, eyes scanning the room until they found Sam. He crossed the room without hesitation and stopped directly in front of the old man. Sam looked up, puzzled at first, then recognition dawned. The folder slipped slightly from his lap as he tried to stand. But before he could fully rise, the general dropped to one knee. "This man," he said, his voice low but commanding enough to carry to every corner of the waiting area, "carried me through enemy gunfire in 1962. I wouldn't be standing here without him." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Dana's fingers froze above her keyboard. Rachel blinked, her hand halfway to her mouth. The two young men in the camo hoodie and baseball caps stared, their faces draining of color. The general stood slowly and saluted, not a casual gesture, a formal, deliberate salute reserved for heroes. Sam blinked hard. His throat worked once, but no sound came. The general turned to the counter. "Get this man's records verified. I don't care how many systems you have to override. I'll sign whatever authorization is needed." Dana nodded, stunned, scrambling to retrieve the folder that just moments ago had been dismissed. The atmosphere shifted palpably. No longer a forgotten old man, Sam was now a thread in history they had all ignored. People rose, unsure what to do. Rachel came around the desk instinctively, placing a hand lightly on Sam's arm. "Let's get you a proper seat, Mr. Carter," she said softly. Sam didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly, but his back was straighter now. As he moved to follow the general, the room parted like a tide, reverent and ashamed. That morning in a modest VA office in Lexington, 70 years of silence, of overlooked valor, misplaced paperwork, and quiet pain were rewritten. Not in a speech, not in a file, but in a single moment of truth that forced everyone in the room to see what they had refused to recognize. The hero had never stopped being a hero. He just kept showing up, waiting for someone to remember. Stung but showing no sign of it, Sam didn't flinch. His hands moved slowly, reverently, as he closed the folder, like he was sealing away something sacred, not just paper and ink. Without saying a word, he stepped to the side, slipping back toward the worn vinyl chairs that lined the lobby. This time, his movements were slower. Each step carried the weight of something unseen, something unspoken. From across the room, Rachel Monroe had caught every word. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but with voices that loud and dismissive, it was impossible not to hear. From her desk, she watched him move. There was a heaviness about him, not broken, but undeniably burdened. And that folder, the way he placed it down, like it was fragile, like it held a piece of something that still mattered. It pulled at her in a way she didn't expect. She blinked, glancing back at her screen. Her job was to review intake forms, not question flagged walk-ins. She knew the drill. If someone didn't appear in the system, they were treated like a blank page, a non-entry. But as Sam settled once again into the chair and gently opened the folder, unfolding papers like they were pieces of a shattered past, Rachel couldn't shake the unease growing inside her. The system had made a mistake, subtle, silent, but very real. And now that mistake was sitting right there, wrapped in a wool coat and 7 decades of dust and silence. Outside Sam Carter's small apartment in Lexington, the night wind howled like a warning, bitter and sharp, shaking the windows in their weather-worn wooden frames. Inside, the dim amber glow of a single lamp filled the room with a quiet, flickering warmth. The rest of the space was still, except for the steady hum of the heater and the occasional groan of the old floorboards protesting the cold. Sam sat slightly hunched in his recliner, the same leather folder resting on his lap. Its contents were now carefully spread out across a small side table, fragile, faded remnants of a life most had forgotten. He reached for a photograph. Its edges were creased, curling with age, the black and white image grainy, but unmistakable. 3 young Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles strapped to their backs, cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but from the biting cold, the snow piled up nearly to their waists. Sam's thumb paused on the man in the center, himself at 27. His uniform crisp, his grin wide, his eyes sharp and filled with something more than awareness. Life, hope, purpose. He shifted his gaze to the man on the right, First Lieutenant Richard Halverson, just 24, straight out of officer school. Back then, his voice carried a confidence too bold and his boots looked too clean for what was coming. Sam could still hear him yelling above the gunfire in Keeson, still feel the weight of Halverson's bloodied body slumped across his shoulders, his eyes closed. February 9th, 1968. The jungle had gone eerily quiet just moments before the ambush. Birds vanished, trees stilled. Then all at once, the sky cracked open. Mortars rained down like fire from the heavens. Men scattered, diving into mud for cover. Halverson had gone down early, shrapnel tearing through his lower back, a lung collapsing. Sam remembered the sprint, through hell, dragging him toward the tree line, bullets slicing the air around them. He had refused evacuation until every man was accounted for. Kept going long after his legs were numb, his hands blistered and raw. Halverson lived, but not all of them did. Tyson didn't make it. Corporal Tyson Hall, quiet, only 21, from South Carolina. He took a bullet to the chest during the retreat and died cradled in Sam's arms as the helicopter finally lifted off. Sam never forgave himself for surviving, but he kept the photograph. It was the only one that captured them together before everything changed. Now, over 50 years later, that photo, creased and fading, sat in a folder that no one cared to open. He looked next at the Bronze Star citation. The ink had nearly disappeared, but he didn't need the words to remember. He remembered the cold, the weight, the silence that always followed. They assumed he came to the VA for a check, for benefits, for some kind of compensation. They didn't understand. He wasn't chasing money. He was chasing something much harder to find. The truth. Somewhere along the line, his name had vanished from the record. Without it, there would be no military honors, no folded flag for his casket, no final resting place beside his brothers. No acknowledgement that he had been there at all. It wasn't money he wanted. It was to be remembered. Back in her apartment, Rachel Monroe leaned over the kitchen table, her face dimly lit by the bluish glow of her laptop screen. The tea next to her had long gone cold, untouched. Her roommate had already turned in for the night, but Rachel's mind was still racing, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard. Sam Carter Quezon, USMC 1968. She hadn't meant to dig into it. Interns weren't supposed to investigate flagged records. They were expected to log the data, file the forms, and stay out of the way. But Sam had carried that folder like it was the last thread holding him together. And his silence, it wasn't the kind that came from forgetfulness. It was the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. The database had said, no record found. But Rachel had been around long enough to know that the system didn't always get it right. She adjusted her glasses, scrolled past pages of irrelevant results, genealogy listings, obituaries, articles about modern veterans. Then her eyes caught something, a blurry scan from an old Lexington Herald newspaper. And just like that, something stirred. Rachel Monroe's fingers hovered over the old scan, her eyes narrowing at the blurred headline. Local Marines cited for bravery at Quezon. Dated March 1969, the article was smudged from age, but the name still emerged through the grainy ink. Corporal Sam Carter. Her breath caught as she continued reading. The second paragraph hit harder. Carter, it read, had carried a wounded officer, Lieutenant R. Halverson, through enemy fire during a fierce February offensive, refusing evacuation until every injured soldier had been accounted for. Rachel's heart stuttered at the name. Halverson. She immediately opened a new tab and searched. Richard Halverson. There it was. Former lieutenant, later promoted. Now listed as General Richard T. Halverson, decorated with a Bronze Star with Valor device, a Silver Star, once Deputy Commander of Pacific Forces, and currently retired in Virginia. Still alive. Rachel leaned back stunned. The pieces were lining up. At least what she could verify. A printed article from 1969. A living four-star general. The story held weight, and yet, when she checked the VA's own database for Sam Carter, the screen came up blank. Nothing, no service record, no medals, no unit, not even a discharge file. It made no sense. Her hands trembled slightly as she scribbled furiously into her notebook. 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, Operation Quezon. Names, dates, newspaper source, cross-references. If the article was true, if Carter really had dragged a wounded officer, now a retired general, to safety in one of the most brutal chapters of the Vietnam War, then the silence surrounding him wasn't just red tape. It was disgraceful. She leaned over her desk again, pulling up a dusty government archive database most interns avoided. It was clunky, barely digitized, a half-buried fossil of a system. But Rachel knew something might still be hidden there. A transfer log, a field report, even a scribbled name on a casualty sheet. She wasn't sure what exactly she was hoping to find. Just something, anything that proved he was real, that he mattered. Because one thing was crystal clear. Sam Carter wasn't asking for charity. He was asking to be remembered. Rachel sat still for a moment, then turned to her email draft. The cursor blinked against the white screen, waiting. She had written and rewritten the message 3 times, trying to strike the perfect tone, respectful but firm. This wasn't just any email. This was a direct message to General Richard T. Halverson himself, a retired 4-star general, a man who, if the article was true, owed his life to the veteran now being ignored in the Lexington VA lobby. She exhaled slowly and read the email again. Dear General Halverson, my name is Rachel Monroe, and I'm currently serving as an intern at the Veterans Affairs Office in Lexington, Kentucky. Earlier this week, I met a veteran named Sam Carter, who has visited our office several times in search of recognition for his service. Unfortunately, we have been unable to locate any official records of his military background. While looking into his claims, I came across a 1969 newspaper article detailing the actions of a Corporal Sam Carter, who reportedly carried a wounded officer, a Lieutenant Halverson, to safety during the Battle of Quezon in February 1968. According to the article, Carter refused evacuation until every wounded soldier was safe. If that officer was you, sir, I believe Mr. Carter's story deserves urgent review. Any information or confirmation you could provide would mean a great deal, both to him and to those of us who believe his story should not be forgotten. Respectfully, Rachel Monroe. Her hand lingered over the mouse, her eyes fixed on the glowing send button. And then she clicked. The email whooshed off into the unknown. Less than an hour later, Rachel was at her desk reviewing routine intake logs when a shadow passed over her shoulder. She turned to see Ron Hastings, her supervisor, arms crossed and jaw clenched. "I heard you've been digging through service records," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. "Off the books." Rachel sat silent. He stepped closer. "That's not your job, Rachel. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop before this becomes a problem." "I just thought," she started. "You're an intern," he snapped, cutting her off. "Not an investigator. And if you want to stay here, I suggest you remember that." Her chest tightened, a flush rose in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "With respect, sir, what if the system's wrong?" His eyes narrowed. "Then someone else will deal with it." And with that, he turned and walked away, not bothering to wait for a reply. Rachel sat frozen in place. The familiar hum of printers filled the room, phones ringing, coworkers chatting in low tones. On the surface, it was just another day, but inside her, something had changed. There was a line now, drawn clear, and she knew without a doubt which side she stood on. She clicked back to her browser. Would the general even read her email? Would he respond? She didn't know, but what she did know with absolute certainty was that Sam Carter wasn't lying. He didn't want a medal. He didn't want praise or fame. He just wanted someone, anyone, to look him in the eye and say, "Yes, we remember." And Rachel Monroe, intern or not, was willing to risk everything to make sure someone did. The next morning, the Lexington VA office stirred to life like always. The faint scent of burnt coffee wafting from the break room, printers groaning into motion. But for Rachel, everything had already changed. General dropped to one knee. Before anyone could move, before the receptionist could react or the guards take a step, General Richard T. Halverson knelt in full uniform before the elderly veteran who had once carried him out of death's grip. Silence wrapped the room tighter than any uniform ever could. Even the humming vents seemed to hold their breath. Sam Carter's mouth parted, but no words came. His body tensed, unsure if he was dreaming. No one, not since 1968, had looked at him like that, with reverence, with memory, with the raw weight of a shared past. Then Halverson spoke, his voice steady and clear, echoing like a command, but trembling with emotion. "Corporal Sam Carter, I never had the chance to do this, and I won't waste another day." He rose slowly but deliberately, and then he saluted. It wasn't a casual gesture, not one done out of obligation or formality. It was precise, earned, absolute, the kind of salute reserved for someone whose courage had transcended duty. Sam just stood there, chest slightly rising and falling beneath his weathered marine jacket. The chipped coffee mug and porch felt a million miles away now. He hadn't expected anything. Certainly not this. The people in the room stood up, one by one. It started with a young intern near the corner, who seemed barely out of school. Then a nurse. A man in a wheelchair straightened as much as he could. Slowly, the room filled with people standing, not in confusion, but in recognition. No one spoke. General Halverson took a deep breath and leaned in, his voice now only for Sam. "They forgot, but I didn't, and I never will." Sam nodded slightly, eyes moist but proud. The folder in his lap was still untouched. It no longer mattered what was inside. The weight of it had been lifted, not by a form or a stamp, but by 4 words he thought he'd never hear again. "We see you now." He never expected vindication, never asked for thanks. But for the first time in decades, Sam Carter felt seen, not as a ghost, not as a forgotten file number, but as a Marine, as a man who once walked through hell and never asked the world to look back. Now the world did, and it saluted. The 4-star general stood with crisp precision, snapping to attention before offering a salute so sharp, so clean, that it cut through the noise like a blade. The moment was sacred. The bustling lobby stilled, as if time itself had paused to honor it. One by one, people rose from their seats. No one told them to stand. They simply knew. This was something rare, something reverent. Sam Carter's hand trembled at his side. For a long beat, he stood frozen, as if caught between the weight of the past and the pull of the present. Then, breathing in slowly, chest tight with emotion, he lifted his hand. He returned the salute, not as a broken man, not as someone forgotten, but as a United States Marine. For the first time in decades, he remembered who he truly was. And he stood in it. The Lexington VA lobby had never looked like this before. The marble floor gleamed under the soft overhead lights, reflecting rows of carefully arranged folding chairs. They were set facing the legacy wall, a long corridor lined with framed portraits and bronze plaques paying tribute to veterans of distinction from the region. On each side of the podium, the American flag stood tall. News crews formed a line in the back, cameras ready. A military color guard dressed in full ceremonial attire waited with quiet discipline near the entry. At the front stood Sam Carter. His shoulders were pulled back just enough, his chin lifted. The stubble was gone, replaced by a clean shave. His old overcoat had been traded for a tailored navy blazer, and on the lapel, the glint of his original unit pin caught the light. He looked smaller under the spotlight, like time had etched itself into his frame. But there was something more solid in him now, something rooted. The battered leather folder he once clutched in search of acknowledgement was gone. He didn't need it anymore. His name was already there, etched in bronze between two-storied World War II pilots. Sergeant Samuel Carter, United States Marine Corps, Battle of Quezon, 1968. That's what the new plaque read. He had once carried others through the fire, never asking to be carried himself. Beside the inscription hung a framed black and white photo, Sam at 27, arm around a fellow Marine, both grinning despite the snow clinging to their uniforms. Then General Halverson stepped up to the podium. His dress uniform was immaculate, every medal aligned, every crease sharp. The room hushed as he began. "I stand here today," he said, his voice measured and low, "because Sergeant Sam Carter refused to leave me behind." He paused, scanning the crowd, grounding himself in the weight of the moment. When mortars fell, when bullets split trees like thunder, when the world turned to chaos, others ran. He didn't. He ran toward me. He took a breath. I was a kid, a green officer. I was bleeding out in the jungle, and he threw me over his back and just kept going. The general's voice cracked ever so slightly, the memory still raw. He turned, locking eyes with Sam. For 55 years, I believed he had died in that war. I spoke his name at my wedding. I toasted him every year on the Marine Corps birthday. I carried the guilt of having lived when I thought he hadn't. He turned back to the audience, and then I found out he was here, sitting quietly in this building, overlooked, forgotten, treated like he didn't matter. A silence settled across the room. "But let me be clear," Halverson said, his tone firm now. "Sergeant Carter is no stranger. He is a hero, and today we fix what never should have been broken." He turned back to Sam and stepped aside. "Welcome home, Marine." The room erupted. Veterans, staff members, students, even children stood and applauded. Some saluted, some wept quietly. The thunder of gratitude rolled through the room. Sam remained still. Then, as if pulled by something deep within, he straightened his back, planted his feet with purpose, and stood like he had all those years ago, silent, proud, unshaken. He didn't need to say a single word. The wall behind him had spoken for him at last. Fridays at the Lexington VA took on a new kind of quiet afterward. Not silence, but reverence. Every week, without fail, Sam came back to that place where he had once been invisible. The ceremonies had ended. The reporters had left. But Sam stayed, not for recognition, not for praise. He came for them, the ones who were still fighting to be seen. He'd sit beside the legacy wall, in the little common space that overlooked the memorial. He'd pour a simple cup of coffee from the shared pot, settle into a chair, and wait. Not to speak, but to listen. Around him, younger veterans began to gather. Some bore visible wounds. Others wore their pain in silence. Most were searching for identity, for peace, for someone who understood. Sam never pushed. Sometimes he'd offer a story, sometimes just a nod. But the power wasn't in what he said. It was in how he made them feel. Seen, understood, not alone. Across from him, Rachel Monroe now wore her own badge. Case Officer Arpsrooms. Monroe. She'd been given the position soon after the ceremony. No one had to explain why. Everyone knew she'd earned it. Each Friday, she and Sam would walk the halls together. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Their bond wasn't born of time, but of truth and the cost of unearthing it. One Friday morning, a class of 8th graders filed through the lobby on a school field trip. Their teacher led them gently toward the legacy wall. When they reached Sam's plaque, she paused. "That's him," she whispered softly, nodding toward the man sitting nearby. Some of the students turned, wide-eyed, curious. Rachel leaned down beside a boy with large glasses and whispered, "He saved a general's life before you were born. Walked through gunfire so someone else could come home." The boy looked from Sam to the plaque, then back to Sam again. "Did it hurt?" he asked, voice barely above a breath. Sam smiled, not because of the question, but because of the courage it took to ask it. "Yeah," he said gently, "it hurt." "Were you scared?" He nodded. "Of course I was. But you still did it." Sam looked at him, eyes soft, voice steady. "Yes," he said. He did it anyway, even though the lines on his face showed a life that had taught him to expect little in return. The boy hesitated, thinking it over. Then, with a flicker of uncertainty, he raised his hand in a small, awkward salute. It wasn't sharp or practiced, but it was sincere. Sam met the gesture with his own, slow, steady, and full of quiet honor. The group of visitors continued on their way, yet the boy kept glancing back, his eyes lingering on the old man on the bench. Sam settled beside Rachel once more. "Do you think it matters?" he asked in a voice just above a whisper. Rachel turned to him and smiled gently, the kind of smile that comes from knowing something deep in your bones. "They'll remember." And somehow he believed her. Now Rachel Monroe stood silently in front of the legacy wall. Her hands were clasped neatly in front of her, and her eyes didn't waver from the bronze plaque engraved with the name Sergeant Samuel Carter. People passed behind her, some wearing uniforms, others pulling along young children. Some paused to read, a few lingered long enough to take in the name and the story behind it. But most never realized how dangerously close that plaque had come to never being mounted at all. Rachel spoke softly, almost as if she were still speaking to Sam. "He never asked for recognition," she said. "Not even once. He never raised his voice, never demanded thanks or attention. All he wanted was for the truth to be remembered. That's it. He just didn't want to be forgotten." She shifted slightly and looked toward the camera, her expression quiet but resolute. "I've worked here long enough to know Sam wasn't alone. There are others, so many others, men and women whose stories got buried beneath paperwork, swallowed by systems that were never built to preserve memory, only to catalog data, statistics, numbers." Rachel paused, letting the silence sit for a moment. "So how many more are there out there?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "How many more veterans sit quietly in waiting rooms, carrying the weight of wars no one asks about? How many walked through hell and came back to silence?" She stepped aside just enough to let the legacy wall come into full view behind her. "If you know someone like Sam, someone whose story was forgotten, erased, or never told, leave their name in the comments. Even a few lines matter. Share their story, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear it." Rachel glanced down briefly, then lifted her gaze again, meeting the camera with a quiet intensity. This channel isn't just about honoring the heroes with medals and statues. It's about remembering those who came home with no parade, no speech, no recognition, just silence. It's about giving them the welcome they never got. Soft, emotional, instrumental music swelled in the background as the screen faded into an image of Sam. He sat peacefully on the bench beside his plaque, a young child sitting next to him, holding a small American flag in both hands. "If this video touched something in you," Rachel's voice continued in voiceover, "please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that restore dignity where it was lost. Because remembering, it's not just respect, It's healing. And sometimes even the smallest gesture, like a salute from a child, can echo through generations. She paused and with one final heartfelt note concluded, "Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering."